and recording on our YouTube. If you do want to ask a question, but you don't feel confident about going live and asking it out loud, if you look down on the bottom of your screen, there's a little it's like a little chat bubble. And that little chat bubble, I do try to watch that chat as we're going along. So I can say, hey, to you all. Yeah, so in that little chat there. So if you do want to ask a question, but you don't feel confident out loud, I do try and watch that. You can usually tell when I'm reading it because my speaking slows down a little bit. The last thing is this could be quite a long tasting. We have only just recently changed over the tasting packs we're sending out. So sometime in the first couple of tasting sessions we do, there is often an overlap. So can I just ask, who here has Sauvignon Blanc in their packs? A couple, but not everyone. So we do have a mix of packs. All right. So there's a few wines that you all have, and there's a few wines that only some of you have, because things like the Sauvignon Blanc, we've actually sold out of our Sauvignon Blanc, so we've had to change the packs over. But you still get to taste them. So if you have a wine, if I'm talking about a wine that you don't have, then don't worry, I'll be onto your wine soon. But it does mean this session is going to be a little bit longer because I'm going to have to cover all the wines at once. But let's get into it, shall we? So how you going, guys? I'm Jeff. I'm finally here after a few technical issues. I'm the winemaker for Tractorless Vineyard. We are based in Barrel in the Southern Highlands. We run our vineyard all biodynamically, and then we run sheep through our vineyard for the whole growing season, which means we're using the tractor about 60% less. And so that's where our name Tractorless comes from. You know, we're trying to be quite a sustainable label. I have this ultimate goal that one day we'll take the entire winery off the grid. You know, we're doing some work with some geothermal people and some new technologies coming through Australia about converting bio waste into energy and things like that. So we're not quite there yet, but we are working towards it. But let's get into the tasting. So if we have, those of you who do have the Sauv Blanc, we will kick off with the Sauv Blanc. This is actually under our Black Sheep label. It's a new label that came about from the bushfires. I'm sure you all remember the bushfires back in 1920. They were really devastating to the wine industry. And one of the main reasons is what we call smoke taint. Now, smoke taint is terrible because you don't have to be near the bushfire to get smoke taint. All you need is smoke. So a lot of vineyards up around Young and up around those regions that weren't actually near the fires also got smoke taint. And the terrible thing about smoke taint is if you taste the grape, it tastes fantastic. You make the wine, it tastes beautiful. You put the wine in bottle, it tastes fantastic. 6 months later in bottle, tastes terrible. It tastes like you've almost poured the wine into an ashtray, then poured it back into the bottle. It's like really, it's not that nice sort of whiskey smoky flavor. It's like a real acrid, terrible, bitter smoky flavor. Luckily this year, well, 1920, we were able to test for smoke taint. So prior to that, it was a lucky dip. You couldn't test for it. You just had to make the wine and hope for the best. Australia actually developed the techniques to test for it, which they now use around the whole world. So the good thing is we could test for it. The bad thing was our entire region and probably most of Eastern Australia got really bad smoke taint and lost all their grapes. So I put a bit of a call out to all my friends in the industry saying, guys, you know, these are the varieties that we're going to run out of, and what do you have? Can we buy some wine? Can we buy some grapes? What have you got? And I had this really good response from a whole lot of old friends with, oh yeah, I've got 100 liters of this, or I've got a kilo or a ton of these grapes. And so I created this label that I call the Black Sheep, and it's essentially a blend of all these different people that sent me their wines. I then made a blend that I wanted to represent our region. So the Southern Highlands is quite a cold region. So our Sauvignon Blanc usually has that quite punchy passion fruit character in it. And so I wanted to make sure that that I made the blend to represent our region. So you still see that real passion fruity character in the Sauv Blanc. I've actually had so much fun making these black sheep wines that we're going to now make it a permanent addition to our range. I'm sure a lot of you have been in various industries. You meet all these people over your time in an industry, but you don't get this opportunity to catch up with them again. And making this wine has been a really good excuse to catch up with all these old friends in the industry. And I've actually had a really great time making it, great time catching up with these friends. Unfortunately, putting this blend together was in 2020. And so I couldn't actually visit them. We had to do it all by Zoom and correspondence. But moving forward, I'm hoping that we'll all open up once again, and I'll actually be able to go visit these people in their wineries, make a bit of a blend with them in their wineries, do some video recording, that sort of thing, and make it a bit of a, I guess, a bit of a tax-free or tax claimable trip to visit all my winemaking friends. So it is a blend from all over Southeast Australia, little batches. Unfortunately, we have also just sold out of the blend, so we are totally out of Sauvignon Blanc now. But it is in that cool climate style, that nice passion fruity. What I love about Australian cool climate Sauv Blancs is they're just a bit softer, I find, than the New Zealand ones. The New Zealand ones can be super punchy and really like in your face. And I just like the slightly more mellowed out version that we do here in Australia. And so we're one of those regions that do that great punchy passion fruit, but it's in a more mellowed out style. If you happen to have like a Jarlsberg or an Edam or something like that in front of you, that's a great match with Sauvignon Blancs usually. But it is a really good example of how cool climate our region is here in Southern Highlands. People think, oh, well, we're up there near Sydney, so we must be fairly similar temperature. But our lowest vineyard is at 500 meters. So we're quite a cold region. It feels like it's snowing out there. Some years we harvest after Tasmania. So we are a really cool climate region. We struggle to ripen things like Shiraz and Cabernet, where Canberra, Orange, Hilltops, they can ripen those varieties. So we are a really cool climate region. Probably us, Tumbarumba, and the upper parts of the Yarra Valley are the three coldest wine regions on mainland Australia. And we're probably on par to some of those Tasmania regions. So varieties like, Sauv Blanc, Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, those sort of cool climate varieties. Sparkling wines. We do a huge range of sparkling wines. I spent a couple of years, or 1 year with Ed Carr and 1 year with Chandon, really honing my skills with sparkling. We do a huge range of sparklings. Unfortunately, I can't put them in the little bottles to send out. But I have had a lot of people asking me to do some virtual sparkling tastings, and we might do something where we look at, maybe a bottle a week or do a pre-recorded. I haven't worked out exactly the logistics of it yet. So those varieties are what do like really well in the Highlands. Something I always get asked about, and we're quite well known for, is our Pinot Gris and Grigios. So that's what we're going to move on to next. And all of you have these ones, so no one's going to miss out. The first one we'll look at is our Pinot Grigio. And I'm going to have some of this with you too. This is the best thing about these virtual tastings, because I don't have to drive home from being at the cellar door. I can join in with a tasting. So we're going to start with our Grigio, and then we're going to go on to our Gris. I always have people coming into our cellar door asking me, what's the difference between Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris? And so I decided I'd make the two wines. I'd make them in their really traditional styles so that we could taste the difference. And the first real big difference we see between Grigio and Gris is actually the philosophy behind the winemaking. So the Italians, to an extent, we can say the Italians are making a wine specifically for a food. It's not 100% true, but Italians are definitely very conscious of food when they're making the wine. The French, on the other hand, The wine is all about the wine. It doesn't mean that the French style matches any less with food, because it matches beautifully with food. It just means that these winemakers have a really different approach to how they're making their wine. And so you end up with really two quite different styles. If you think about Italy, it's quite warm in Italy, a lot of maritime climate, a lot of seafood. So the Italians are trying to create something that's really fresh and zippy and crisp and steely. So the first thing I do when I'm making the Grigio is I actually harvest it a lot earlier. So the alcohol percent in a Grigio or traditional Grigio is usually around about 11 to 12% alcohol. And we talk about a sugar reading of the grapes of 11, 12 Beaumet. And there's like thousands of different ways to measure sugar. It's like Beaumets and Olschlers and specific gravity and grams per liter. Winemakers like Beaumet because it's a really easy conversion. If I take 1 Beaumet of sugar and I ferment it with yeast, I end up with 1% alcohol. So it's just a 1-for-1. So we're harvesting these grapes at 11, 12 Beaumet, which turns into 11, 12% alcohol. So that's the first big difference. It's a lot earlier than the French. The second thing is the Italians use a lot of oxygen in their ferments, and they do it quite cool. So when I'm making this, I actually press off all the juice into a tank, and then I fill a bucket from the bottom of the tank, and I tip it in the top, and I fill it from the bottom, and I tip it in the top. And I might do that 10, 20 times until all of that juice goes brown from the oxygen. And then I do a really long, slow, cold ferment. And that oxygen and that long, slow, cold ferment, it helps me stabilize some of the flavors in the wine, but it also helps me give what we call a steely palate. And traditional Grigios have this steely palate. They're really famous for this steely palate. What do I mean by a steely palate? Have a look around your house, find a bit of stainless steel and give it a lick. Now make sure it's clean first, because it's not the best time to be licking surfaces that aren't clean. But this is what I'm talking about when I talk about a steely palate. It's kind of a clean, metallic-y feel. It's almost more of a sensation or a texture rather than an actual taste. It's this metallic-y, crisp sensation on the tongue. And that's what we're really trying to recreate in these Grigio or Italian styles. One of the things that actually is quite difficult with Italian styles, and I find it with all their styles, not just their Grigio, but all their Italian wines, is they're really hard to taste in a wine tasting scenario. Because they really are made to go with food, and because of the techniques that we use to make them, all their flavors are quite bound up. And so when we look at this now, we're only seeing a little snapshot of what it has to offer. So, you get pears and apples and a lot of those fresh fruity characters. If you were to take that wine and sit it on your desk or your table for the rest of the evening and taste it at different temperatures and taste it at different flavors, with different foods, what you'll see is all these different flavors come out of that wine at different times. So you taste it now and you see a couple of flavors, and you taste it with a bit of cheese and you'll see another couple of flavors, and you taste it in an hour's time and you'll see another couple of flavors. And if you think about how the Italians eat their food, they have this really long, drawn out sort of grazing process. And that's why this way of making wine really matches that way of eating, because the flavors change throughout the whole evening. It makes it difficult for us to judge a wine because all we see is what this wine is offering this second. It's like a snapshot of the wine. We don't see what it's offering over its whole lifetime. So quite often, if I'm tasting a wine in a cellar door and I think it's made in that more Italian style, I will often put that aside and make sure that's one of the wines that I come back and taste a second time later on in the tasting, just to see how it's evolving. So it does make it quite difficult. What we might do is actually jump over to our Pinot Gris. because it does make it a little bit easier for me to explain the difference between the Grigio and Brie when we have something to compare it to. So that's our Grigio, the Italian style. They harvest it early, they ferment it cold, and lots of oxygen in the ferment, and it creates a zippy, crisp, steely style of wine. The French, on the other hand, if you think about where most of the Pinot Gris is grown in France, it's mainly grown in Alsace, which is on the French-German border. So that's a colder region. The French, the wine is all about the wine. And the French are trying to create something that's big and round and voluptuous and viscous. So the first thing that the French do is, when I'm making that style, I actually let the grapes ripen for another about 3 or 4 weeks. So a traditional French style Gris is normally around about probably 13 to 14% alcohol, which is about 3 or 4 weeks after a Grigio is harvested. The French, they love to confuse us because Pinot Gris is the name of the variety, but it is also the name of the way that the French make that variety. So there's a bit of a double up there, which is nice and confusing for us all. But the first big difference you notice with the French style, and you'll probably see it better in your glass, is that color difference. It's got this real sort of bronzy, almost pinky tinge to it. And that's because of that ripeness level. And Pinot Gris is a really interesting white grape variety. It's one of the only white grapes in the world that when it starts getting really ripe, it actually starts turning red. And so when you get to that sort of high 12s, early 13s, the skins on the Pinot Gris start turning pink. And it's actually where the name comes from, because when you have all these little pink berries on a bunch, and that bunch is hanging out in the vineyard, they get a bit of a light dusting on the outside of them, and from a distance, the bunches look grey. And the French word for grey is gris. So Pinot, because it's related to Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and Gris, because the bunches look grey on the grapevines. Now, the Italians, they don't get that colour in the wine. Because they're harvesting it nice and early, it hasn't developed that colour yet. And so a traditional Grigio normally has like a more like that greeny sort of color you get in a white wine, whereas a French style Gris often has that bronzy or pinker color. And in Australia, in warmer climate regions, the color development is more in warmer weather. And so if you have drunk a lot of Australian Pinot Gris, it's highly likely that you, somewhere along your drinking trail, have drunk a pink Pinot Gris or a rosé colored Pinot Gris. And that's because in warmer regions, you get much more color development. And so as a result, you get that real pinking color. But traditionally, you don't quite get as much of that color. And so you get this bronzy sort of color in a traditional French style Gris. The next thing you notice, if you look really carefully at your glass, you'll sort of see about here is a clear rim of liquid, which is then dribbling back down into the glass. And we call that the legs of the wine. And what that is everything volatile. So everything in that wine that can evaporate out at room temperature, it evaporates out. It condensates on the glass around here, and then it dribbles back down into the wine. Now, this is essentially alcohol. So the reason we see this much more in the Gris is we got 13 to 14% alcohol. In the Grigio, we don't have as much alcohol, so you don't see those legs as much. But what this alcohol does is something really interesting to the wine. If you were to give your glass a little bit of a swirl and a good smell, you'd probably notice that there's a huge amount of fruit jumping out of that wine. Like, it's really fruity compared to the Grigio. The funny thing is that if I was to scientifically analyze the aroma compounds of the Grigio and the aroma compounds of the Grigio's actually got loads more. And what's happening is, as that alcohol is evaporating out of the wine, it's grabbing on to all the other flavor components with it, and pulling it out of the wine. So when we smell it, we're getting hit with all that flavor all at once. If you were to take the Gris and sit it on your table for the rest of the evening, taste it with different foods, taste it with different temperatures, it really wouldn't change that much. And this is one of the biggest differences between Grigio and Gris. Pinot Gris is, hey, look at me, this is everything I have to offer. Whereas Pinot Grigio is very shy. It'll be showing you a couple of flavors, and then you need a change in temperature, and then it'll show you another couple of flavors, and you need a change in food, and it'll show you another couple of flavors. So the way these two wines show you the flavor is one of the really big differences between Grigio and Gris. And the reason for this is because we don't actually taste these flavors. So we're not tasting peach, we're not tasting apple, we're not tasting pear, we're actually smelling them. So our tongue only has the ability to taste sweetness, sourness, bitterness, saltiness, and umami, which is MSG. So when we eat a peach and we, in inverted commas, taste the peach, what's actually happening is as we chew it and swallow it, some of the aroma compounds of the peach become airborne, and we detect it in the nasal passage. And I don't know if you remember when you're a kid and you're forced to eat your Brussels sprouts, so you used to block your nose. And what we're doing is we're stopping the flow of those aromatics through our nasal passage, so we don't taste our Brussels sprouts. So for us to be able to taste a flavor, it needs to be airborne. In the case of the Pinot Gris, everything is being made airborne by that alcohol. In the case of the Grigio, because of the way we've made it and the lower alcohol, only some of those flavors are made airborne. So we need a change in temperature or a change in chemical structure to release those other flavors. And one of my favorite matches with that Pinot Grigio is fresh oysters. And you taste it now and you get that apples and pears, tastes quite fruity, and then you match it with a fresh oyster and you get these beautiful yeasty, cheesy characters, and you think, where did that come from? Because I can't taste that at all in the wine now, but when I have it with an oyster, I get all these different flavors out. And that's a really good example in how that oyster is changing the chemical structure of the Grigio, and it's causing it to release all these different flavors. So that way the flavors are shown is a big difference. The final thing, when you taste that Pinot Gris, it's big, it's round, it's voluptuous. And one of the key things we're looking for in a Pinot Gris, it kind of has this oiliness to it, like an oily viscosity. And that oily viscosity comes from a warm ferment. And this is one of the balancing acts we're playing as a winemaker. A nice cold ferment gives me high aromatic compounds, but not much mouthfeel. A nice warm ferment gives me lots of mouthfeel, but not much aromatic compounds. So we're normally always finding this balance between aromatics and mouthfeel, and aromatics and mouthfeel. With Gris and Grigios, it's easy because we just created two different styles. We've created the Italian Grigio, which is all about aromatics and zippiness and not much mouthfeel, and we've created the French Gris, which is all about big, round mouthfeel. So it's quite easy winemaking wise because we've split these two styles. Things like Riesling or Chardonnay, we're trying to find a balance between that mouthfeel and those aromatics, whereas these styles are quite different styles. Now, I have made these in their real traditional way. So the Grigio at this end, the Gris at this end. You can imagine, though, in real life, you've got all the variations in between, and then you've got this funny area in the middle, which I call an Australian Gris, because a lot of the Gris that we get in Australia are either a fresh Gris or a complex Grigio. So they really sit in that middle. One of the difficult things for us here is there's no definition of Gris and Grigio. So when you go to a bottle shop, it is really a lucky dip what you're going to get. And I have consulted and worked with big companies before who we would make an Australian style Gris, and in summer we would label it Grigio, and in winter we would label it Gris. So it is really challenging for us as consumers in Australia to know what we're getting. A couple of little things you can do. You can look at the alcohol. If the alcohol is 11 to 12%, it's going to be a Grigio. If it's 13 to 14%, it's going to be a Gris. Unfortunately, most of them sit in between 12 and 13, right in the middle. So then it becomes really a big stylistic thing on what the winemaker was doing when he made that wine. It is starting to change a bit. When I used to enter a wine in a wine show, I would enter it as a wine made from a Pinot Gris grape. Now, when I enter a wine in a wine show, I either enter it as a Grigio or a Gris. And so if I was to take that Gris, for example, which is a beautiful Gris, and put it in a Grigio wine class, it would get 0 marks because it's not a Grigio. And so what will happen now over the next 3 years or 4 years, the wine show will clearly define what's a Grigio and what's a Gris. And eventually that will flow on to labeling law. And eventually we'll walk in and we'll be able to actually tell the difference between a Gris and a Grigio.
That's me.
For Europe, it's kind of the same. Like, you don't have a definition of Gris and Grigio, but what you have over there is what we call appellation control rules. So if I'm in Italy and I want to get the government seal of approval, which is the DOC, I have to make my wine according to what they tell me to make my wine. And so the way they tell you to make their wine in Italy to get the seal of approval is harvesting early, cooler ferment, more oxygen. So it creates that Grigio style. In France, to get that government seal of approval, it's harvesting late, cooler, warmer ferments, a bigger, rounder style. So by default, Gris and Grigios are controlled over in Europe, but it's not because of the naming. It's more because of the government controls on winemaking in those countries. And so it's something that we don't have here in Australia. I can make a wine however I want, but in Europe, they are actually controlled how they make a wine. And so that's why you end up with those real different styles. Did you guys have a favorite at all? Great. You can put it in the chat. I used to be able to do polls on here, but I can't work out how to do it anymore. Usually I get couples coming to the cellar door. One of them likes a Gris, one of them likes a Grigio. But that's fine by me because it means I sell them 2 bottles instead of 1. So I'm happy for them to disagree. Food makes a big difference. I will usually see, I start seeing people a lot. Last year, because we were shut the whole year, I was doing hundreds of these virtual tastings, and we've only just kicked off doing them again this year. But usually I'll have someone who will do a tasting like this, and then they'll go, I want to do a private tasting with my workmates. So they'll do a private tasting with their workmates, and then they'll do a private tasting with their friends. So I'll see them pop up quite regularly. And the first time they do it, they quite often do it without food. And then the second time they do it with food. And interestingly, they'll say the first time they did it without food, they love the Gris, but the second time they did it with food, they love the Grigio. And it's really interesting how those wines do interact with food. These are good wines to remember when you have spicy food. So Gris and Grigios, for some reason, can just handle that spice. It's really hard to find a wine that matches spicy foods. And so these are my absolute go-to. If I'm having Vietnamese or Thai or something that's fresh and spicy, I'll go with the Grigio. If I'm having something like a Malaysian or Indian or something that's a bit more creamy and spicy, I'll go the Pinot Gris. And for some reason, they're really good wines to remember for those sort of spicy foods. What about Chardonnays? Do we have many Chardonnay drinkers? So I see a few thumbs. Oh, there's a good number today. That's great. I love it. I when I was doing big sessions last year, I used to love asking that question because I'd probably get about 30 or 40% of people saying yes, and 60, 70% of people saying no, I don't drink Chardonnay. And the funny thing is that the biggest selling white wine in Australia and the biggest selling white wine in our cellar door is Chardonnay. So there must be a lot of closet Chardonnay drinkers out there somewhere. Maybe it's maybe it's because of Kath and Kim. Maybe they scared everyone away from admitting that they drink Chardonnay. I actually think it's a little bit to do with the history of Chardonnay. The next Chardonnay we're tasting, you all have, so you can all. No one's going to miss out on this wine. And that's our younger Chardonnay. So some of you don't have the 15. Everyone's got the younger one. I mean, younger. That's the one on. Anyway, so the history of Chardonnay, we went from the 70s and 80s where we had these super oaky, super buttery styles, and then we went to late 90s, early 2000s where we had these unoaked fruity styles. And I think we all have a memory of something that's too oaky, too buttery, too fruity, not fruity enough, not oaky enough, not buttery enough. And we're all a bit unsure about Chardonnay. For me personally, Chardonnay is all about balance. So I want to see a bit of fruit. I want to see a bit of oak. I want to see that nice little bit of butteriness, but I don't want any one of those flavors to overpower the other flavor. I want them all working nicely together. And when you taste this Chardonnay, you really see that. You start off with that nice little bit of vanilla-y oak. I don't use any new oak. I find that the first year in oak is a little bit too overpowering. So I use 2, 3, and 4-year-old oak. You then get that little lick of butteriness before it goes into mangoes and grapefruits and a citrusy finish. But the key for me is that balance. It's sort of going oaky, buttery, grapefruity, citrusy, and just like that. It's not going like oaky and then buttery and then mangoey. It's all about that nice balance. And I have no problem with a super oaky Chardonnay as long as it's got nice fresh flavors to balance that. And I have no problem with a super fruity Chardonnay as long as it's got some nice textural savory notes to balance out that fruit. So for me, it's all about balance. I am a huge fan of Australian Chardonnay. I think that Australia as a whole is making some of the best Chardonnay that we've ever made. I've been making wine now, 22 years. I've made oaky Chardonnays. I've made fruity Chardonnays, and now I'm finding a nice balance. And I think a lot of winemakers around Australia, they've done the same thing. They've gone through that evolution. The shame is that we're not talking about Chardonnay anymore. We're all talking about Grise and Hustlervus and all these new trendy varieties that are coming through. And so I was going to get a hat made up that said, make Chardonnay great again, because it is one of my little side projects to get people to drink Chardonnay again, because I really do. You think about down in Victoria, you've got the Yarra Valley, you've got Geelong, you've got Mornington, all putting out these beautiful balanced Chardonnays. Up here in New South Wales, we've got Canberra, we've got Orange, we've got our region, the Southern Highlands, we've got Tumbarumba, again, all putting out these beautiful balanced style Chardonnays, but we're just not talking about them anymore. So it is a little bit of a side project of mine to bring Chardonnay back again, make it cool again. And so even though I don't want to push you into liking Chardonnay again, I do hope that showing you these Chardonnays does open your mind up to maybe tasting them a bit more, because it is the wine that we sell in the cellar door. Probably most people say no, they don't want to taste it. And most of them who do taste it end up buying it. So it is one of those real wines that people have an idea of what Chardonnay is, and it's not what we're tasting generally around Australia for Chardonnay. So we are getting some great balanced Chardonnays now. So for half of us, we're going to taste our 2015 Chardonnay. The other half don't have the 2015 Chardonnay, I'm afraid. So the 15 again is made in the exact same style as the first one. The reason I wanted to include it for those of you who don't have it in the new packs is it's just starting to develop one of my favorite characters in aged white wine, and that's sort of a toasty character. So I'm a huge fan of aging wines. I love aged Semillons. I love aged Chardonnays. And one of the things that I really look for when I start seeing those aged is it literally is like a toasty character. And we're just starting to see this in the 2015 Chardonnay. So those of you who do have the 15, it's a really interesting comparison between the two, because you do see those similar mango, grapefruity, citrusy characters, but that 15 is really starting to develop that nice toasty note. And that's something that I love in aged whites. This is something that we offer to our club members. It's something that we really work hard is to, I love wine and I love aged wines. And so we really don't age wines that well anymore. I think 95 or 96% of wines are drunk within 24 hours of them being purchased. And so I wanted to age wines so that I could share aged wines with you guys. So we usually, when we're down to our last pallet or two, we'll actually put wines aside and we'll age them, and then we'll do a museum release wine. So I'm not sure if any of you guys are on our club list already. We do get a lot of club members jumping on these. But when we send out our cases of wine, we usually try and send out a couple of bottles that are only on our museum wine list in those cases. So you are getting something that's quite interesting. It is a project of mine which I haven't quite got to yet, but I do want to release another virtual wine tasting, which will literally be parallel tastings of a couple of our wines, looking at 3 or 4 vintages, so we can really look at the progression of them. Something that I love about boutique wines is that you can really taste every year. So for us and for all boutique wines, a 15, a 16, a 17 should all taste different, because they're all different years. There's different climates each year. There's different growth patterns each year. One of the things that it's kind of a bit of fun, but I didn't like when I was working for big companies. So my background is consulting to big companies. That, for example, when I was with Jacobs Creek, a Jacobs Creek Shiraz needs to taste like a Jacobs Creek Shiraz every single year. It needs to taste the same. So what we do is we're blending grapes from all over Australia so that every time you buy a Jacobs Creek Shiraz, it tastes the same. With a boutique winery, it's quite different. We want every year to represent that year, not to represent the wine. We want to represent that year. And the French call it terroir. And it's all about how the season and the people making it really affect the flavors in the wine. And so those parallel tastings are really quite interesting, because the wines look similar. You can tell they're from the same sort of vineyard, but they're actually quite different each year. And you can sort of see that between the two Chardonnays as well. So the last white, yeah. So I think we all on the same white. We all now have the same one together, which is our semi-dry Riesling. I was tossing up between whether I send out our dry Riesling or our semi-dry. I think in Australia we get to see so many great examples of dry Riesling. We don't get to see so many great examples of a semi-dry. And so that's why I wanted to include our semi-dry in the pack. I think a lot of the problem is that if I'm working with a big company and I'm making a big batch of wine to make sweet, that ferment is so strong you can't stop it. It's literally like me standing in front of a semi-trailer like this trying to stop it. It's just not going to happen. So if I'm doing a big batch of, say, 20,000 liters, what I have to do is ferment it dry and then back add the sweetness. And when you're back adding the sweetness, you end up with this more sort of caramelized, cloying sweetness to the wine. If you're making it in a more traditional German style, you can only do small batches. So we can only do about 3,000 or 5,000 liters at a time. We start it fermenting. And when the sweetness level is where we want it, we chill it and filter it and stop the ferment. So we're retaining the natural sweetness of the grape rather than adding sweetness. And so what that does is it gives you this real sort of lush, juicy sweetness rather than a sugary, like cloying sweetness. And this is quite a sweet wine. So this is, if you go by the German ranking of sweetness, this is just before it becomes a dessert wine. And I deliberately made it that way because I wanted to demonstrate how a really sweet wine, if you use those traditional techniques, can actually still be quite fresh and juicy. And, you know, for us in Australia, you taste a wine like that and you immediately want to put it with a cheese platter or with dessert or something. But for me, on a really nice warm day, matched with some antipasta or matched with a nice Waldorf salad, this is a great aperitif, which, you know, a great way to start a meal. And if you had that cloying, hanging around sweetness, you couldn't do that. It's sort of like it would clog up the palate. But, you know, you have a glass of this and you're like, oh, actually, that's quite fresh. I could have another one. I could have another one. And, you know, and especially on a hot day, it's a great way to start the meal rather than end it. And I think I really wanted to show this style. We don't get it that often here in Australia. You know, we don't see a huge selection of German wines or European wines. I do a lot of these tastings over in America as well, and they have a really good selection of European wines. I guess because we're so much further away from Europe than America, we don't get as big a selection. So that's why I wanted to include it in the tasting, is this style of wine. I think the other reason we don't see it as often is because it's quite a difficult wine to make. You know, you can imagine putting an off-dry wine into a bottle in Australia with our warm climate. It's very hard to stop it fermenting a second time in the bottle. And so your cleanliness and stability is a big issue. And I think that's the other reason people shy away from these styles. But I think it's a beautiful style, and that's why I wanted to include it. You know, it's a great match with those sort of light blue cheeses, like the gorgonzolas and that sort of thing. One of my favorites is actually figs wrapped in prosciutto stuffed with gorgonzola, and I think that is a really nice match with this wine as well. I can see you're drooling now. I did try and do one of these tastings where I sent out like food suggestions, and I did the same thing here, but it didn't work because I spent the whole time with food in my mouth trying to talk. And so now I just let you guys have your own food. I get jealous over your food. So that's all our whites. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to our reds on the whites? There'll be plenty of time anyway to ask questions, but whilst it's all fresh in our minds, all good. So reds. The first red we're going to taste is We All Have It. It's our 2018 Pinot Noir. We do a couple of Pinot Noirs. At the moment, we do 2. We're about to do 3. Our 2018 Pinot Noir is off a block that we have that is surrounded by eucalypt trees and pine trees. And I talked earlier about this idea of terroir that the French talk about. And I definitely get a lot of terroir in this wine. Because of those eucalypt and piney trees, I always get this real eucalypty character in this wine. We have talked about moving those eucalypt trees, but I do think it's a real terroir of that block, and so we haven't. As a result, when I make this wine, I use loads and loads of stems in it. I find that if you make this Pinot like a traditional Australian style Pinot, that eucalypty character clashes a little bit with the strawberry and cherry characters that you normally get in a Pinot. And so that's why we use a lot more stems in this. And so we make a more spice driven, a little bit floral. You get a little bit of that geranium character style of Pinot. We wanted to keep it that way because that is a real good representation of that block. We do have another block that we're just starting to produce off, which doesn't have eucalypt trees. So that's going to be our 3rd Pinot. So we'll have a Pinot in the next couple of years that will come out that is a more fruit driven, strawberry, cherries like you normally would expect from an Australian Pinot. We will have this Pinot, which is our spice driven eucalypty character. And then we've got an old school funky Burgundian style as well, which is like an old French style. heaps of whole bunches, heaps of stems, you know, real funky sort of style. So a lot of Pinots, but this is a good example of terroir. It is that spicy floral sort of style of Pinot, and probably something that if you're a big Pinot drinker, you probably never tried anything really like this. It is quite different flavors for a Pinot. I make this in using more Australian techniques. I find that Australian techniques give you brighter sort of fruit. I'm a huge fan of texture in my wine, so a lot of our other wines are made using more European techniques. The problem with those European techniques, you get great texture, but you lose a bit of that beautiful, vibrant, bright fruit character, or vibrant, bright sort of spice character to it. And so that's why I make this Pinot in that more Australian style. So it's just got that brightness to it a little bit. But quite a different style Pinot, for sure. The next wine we have is our Merlot. I'm just thinking quickly, you all do have the Merlot, so that's all the same. There's only a couple that are different. I normally never, ever bottle a Merlot by itself. For me, traditionally, Merlot's always been a blending wine. Usually in Australia, I find the Merlots are soft and round, but lack a bit of texture. I think a little bit that's because a lot of the clones that we have had in Australia are not the right clones. In 2015, for some reason, we had this amazing structure in the Merlot. And so one of the great things about having your own little vineyard and winery is you can do what you want. And so in 2015, I didn't blend this wine, and it ended up being bottled by itself because the texture was just amazing. I had to keep it separate. You know, a lot of people I show this Merlot to, and it is a cracking Merlot. You know, normally if a Merlot just doesn't have that ball of tannin in the middle that this does, and it just has this structure to hold it through. So I really had to bottle this separately. It normally gets blended into our blend that we call the Lost Flock. The problem with not having the Lost Flock, because I've sold out of it, and having the Merlot is the Lost Flock was a really good segue into my sheep story. And now I don't have a segue into my sheep story, but I use the fact that I don't have a segue into my sheep story to segue into it. So here comes my sheep story. I did mention that sheep are really integral in what we do, and we use them in the vineyard a lot, which actually came back in 2013. We had a caterpillar problem in our vineyard. And the biodynamic philosophy says that if you have insect problems on your land, it's because you don't have enough animals. And so we started experimenting with sheep. And first we tried Dorpers. I thought Dorpers perfect. Easy to look after. They're wool sheds, so you don't have to worry about shearing them. I thought these are going to be easy sheep. So we got all these Dorpers. Well, a Dorper is pretty much like a goat, and they ate half the vineyard. So that experiment did not work well at all. I grew up on a sheep farm. We had merinos on our sheep farm, and merinos are what you call a grazing sheep. So a Dorper is a browsing sheep, which means they just look everywhere for food and they'll eat it. A merino is a grazing sheep. So they only look inside their feeding zone for food, and they won't look outside of their feeding zone until they've eaten all the food in their feeding zone. So the merinos, they kind of worked. The grapevine sat here, which was outside of their feeding zone. The bunches hung down just inside of their feeding zone. So that year, we lost a lot of fruit, but we were getting closer. Eventually, we found a rare breed of sheep called a Hampshire Down. It's a breed from the UK. They are a grazing sheep, the same as a merino. Actually, if I turn my video off, you can sort of see it, kind of see in the background there, our Hampshire Downs. They've got the little black face, but not the black head. The black head is a suffix. The suffix are a bit taller. The Hampshire Downs have the little black face, but a little bit of wool, white wool that comes down the nose. They're a grazing sheep, which is the same as a merino. The biggest difference between a merino and a Hampshire Down is a Hampshire Down is 2 inches shorter. So with the merino, the bunches were hanging just inside their feeding zone. With the Hampshire down, they were just outside of the feeding zone. So what that means is we can actually run our sheep underneath the vineyard for the entire growing season. Now, this has solved our caterpillar problem. And I don't know why I didn't think about it at the time. I guess I was so obsessed with this caterpillar problem, I wasn't thinking about anything else. But guess what? Sheep eat grass. And the most expensive part of running a biodynamic or organic vineyard is managing the grass. Because with a normal industrial vineyard, all we do is we either herbicide all the grass or we herbicide strips underneath the grapevine. So it's quite easy to manage the grass. With organics and biodynamics, we don't want a herbicide. So we spend a lot of time mulching and whippersnipping and trying to manage the grass. Now we've got the sheep, they do it all for us for free. So the sheep really have fundamentally changed what we do. You know, we've taken something that is a really philosophical choice to be biodynamic, but it's an expensive choice. And with the introduction of sheep, it's actually now cheaper for us to run our biodynamic vineyards than it would a normal industrial vineyard. So they really have changed the way we do things. The other thing is that the Hampshire Downs are really cool because they're not flocking sheep. So merinos and Dorpers, they flock. And so you end up with these sheep camps where all the manure is in one spot. They follow each other, so you get these tracks of compaction through the vineyard. The Hampshire Downs are roaming sheep, so they just spread out throughout the whole vineyard. They don't like being together. It's absolutely fantastic for the vineyard because we don't get compaction. We don't get these sheep camps. It's a nightmare when I go to shear because there's always one sheep wandering around the vineyard somewhere. So I always end up with this one woolly sheep. I've actually decided that's a really good name for a wine, the woolly sheep. I just have to come up with a nice blend or something that will work for that name. Maybe a port or something like that. But so they're really great sheep for us. Someone's asked, what's biodynamics? So biodynamics, so we have organics. Organics is basically, if I want to be organic, all I have to do is not use anything that's man-made. So I can't use herbicides, I can't use pesticides, I can't use any man-made chemicals. To be biodynamic, first, I'm not allowed to use any man-made chemicals, but I also have to follow the biodynamic philosophy. Now, the biodynamic philosophy was developed about 100 years ago by a famous academic at the time called Rudolf Steiner. And what happened, and it's the same Steiner who, the Steiner schools and Montessori learning, that sort of thing. So what happened was when the Industrial Revolution came through Europe, a lot of farmers around Austria were finding that they were getting more disease. They were starting to have problems that they've never had before. And so they went to this famous academic and said, hey, what's going on? Well, why are we getting these problems? And he came up with this philosophy that he calls the biodynamic philosophy. Now, if you read it, it can seem very hippy-dippy spiritual because it talks about the moon and the stars and the influence of the planets and those sorts of things. I come from a hardcore science background. You know, we've got like generations and generations of scientists. So I'm always like wanting to understand it from a scientific point of view. Basically what it is though, is doing what we did before the Industrial Revolution. It's just doing what we did. We never used to go, okay, it's the 4th of July. I'm going to harvest, I'm going to plant, our cotton. We never used to do that. The farmers used to be farmers. They had pigs, they had cows, they had sheep, they had cotton, they had vineyards. You know, you didn't have this monocot thing. So that was one difference. The other difference is that they didn't just plant on the 1st of July or after the rain. When that flower was flowering and that bird was nesting and the soil was doing this, that's when they planted. So the philosophy is really based on tapping into those natural cycles of the earth way back, what they used to do pre-industrial revolution. Probably the most famous thing that most people know is what we call 500. And it's a preparation where we get a cow horn and we fill it with manure and we bury it under the ground at a certain time of the year in a certain place on your farm. And then we dig it up and we make we mix it with water, and then we spray that out on the land. Now, effectively what we're doing is super concentrating all our micronutrients in microorganisms in that cow horn, and then we're inoculating our soil. So it's really about looking at everything that you do around you, and everything has an influence. You know, a normal farmer will go, I have caterpillars, I will spray for caterpillars. A biodynamic farmer goes, I have caterpillars. Why do I have caterpillars? It means that the natural balance of my land is not right for me to have caterpillars. So we still have caterpillars, but they're no longer a problem. They're not causing any damage. Like, we're all happy in our nice little equilibrium now. And from a scientific point of view, I think it's that the sheep, they eat the grass, they keep the grass lower, they're eating some of the life cycle of the caterpillars goes through the grass. And so they've got less habitat to lay their eggs. Some of the eggs are probably being eaten by the sheep. And so we've got this nice balance of caterpillars now. So, you know, biodynamics for me is looking at that real sort of mini ecology on your own property. But it can be people get very scared away because we are doing a lot of following the moon and the stars and the planets. You know, we all know that the moon influences water. You know, we know tides. We can measure in plants sap flow differences and things like that with the influence of the moon. The philosophy of Steiner believes that different planets influence other elements in the world as well. And so that aspect of it links into that natural timing of the planet. But it can be a bit, you know, when you first read it, people are like, wow, what's this going on about? Harvesting naked in the moon or something like that. It's not that extreme though. But it can be like, from an outsider looking at it, it can look quite crazy. Like, we do all our pruning according to the astrological calendar. So I prune on what we call a fruit day. So there's different days when everything aligns. It's either a fruit day, a root day, a leaf day, or a flower day. And if you do things on your plants on those days, you're I guess helping those things. We want the fruit, so we do everything on our vines on fruit days. So I hope that's a little insight onto biodynamics. I hope that explains it okay. Let's go back to wine. What we're up to, Merlot. Merlot, that's right. So yes, cracking Merlot. I really love this Merlot. The same block, I thought it was only in 2015, but we are also just about to release a 2017 Merlot and a 2018 Merlot. And once again, that beautiful same texture. So it must be something about that block. You may notice that this comes under our Creators series. So we have our Sustainable series and our Creators series. It is far too cold in the Southern Highlands to grow Merlot or Merlot or Shiraz or Cabernet. And so I work very closely with some growers in Young. Because it's not off our biodynamic box here locally, it goes under our Creators series. So the Sustainable series is 100% off our biodynamic box. The Creators series is not. And so that's why they're different series. So that's our Merlot. Next up, we got our Shiraz, and we do all have our Shiraz as well. I love showing the Shiraz. If you ask me to pick a wine in Australia that typified young, I still consider myself young, even though I'm over 40 now. I still consider myself a young winemaker. Young sort of Australian winemakers and what they're doing. Cool Climate Shiraz would be one of the wines that I picked. It is something that young winemakers have really sort of honed as their own in Australia. I love, and I had to do a Shiraz because it's been part of my history forever. You know, my first job when I finished school, I didn't know whether I wanted to do winemaking or not. And so I got a job at a winery in Canberra called Clonakilla, and they are super famous for their Cool Climate Shiraz. So I worked with the Kirks there for 3 years in Clonakilla. They're one of the reasons I did winemaking. They really did instill a passion for wine in me way back then. So Shiraz has really been ingrained in my winemaking history. It's a variety that put Australia on the world wine map. We are famous around the world for our Shiraz. You know, originally it was those big old school Barossa McLaren Vale Shirazes. And then in the last 10 years, we're sort of getting really well known for those more ethereal sort of cool climate styles. There is talk in the industry about defining the two styles, maybe calling all the big old Barossa styles Shiraz and these new cool climate delicate styles Syrah, so that we can really tell the stylistic difference between the two. This would be in that Syrah sort of style of things. If you do drink a lot of cool climate Shiraz, this is exactly what you would expect to get. And the thing that I love about cool climate Shiraz is the structure. So when you taste this, have a think about where that furriness is on the tongue. And you sort of get right down the middle of the tongue, this nice line of furriness. And that texture on that wine, what it does is it creates structure. So if you think about a really warm climate Shiraz, they have all this complex flavor and this intense flavor, and they just sort of go, there you go, and they just throw it at you, and you're like, whoa, that's amazing, but wow, all at once. These cool climate wines have all this complex, intense flavor. Because of that beautiful structure, they're kind of just handing you the flavor and handing you the flavor and handing you the flavor rather than throwing it at you all at once. And that's what I really love about these cool climate styles, you know, is that way it gives you the flavor. For me, that structure is really important, that nice linear structure. Canberra, Young, and Heathcote are probably the three regions in Australia that I think consistently give you that structure. And so that's why I work really closely with the growers in Young, and that's where we get this Shiraz from. It's from those growers up there. So again, it's under under the Creators Series label because it's from that region. Heathcote, I think, is another great region down there in Victoria that gives you that beautiful structure. You know, a lot of regions sometimes do give you that structure, sometimes don't, but Canberra, Heathcote, and Young, I think, consistently give you that beautiful structure. And this is, for me, this is what cool climate Shiraz is all about. It's got that delicacy, it's got that beautiful dark chocolate, little bit of plum. The thing that I find really hard with cool climate Shiraz is they can be super spicy. So I want to get a little bit of hint, little bit of pepper, little bit of cinnamon without it being over the top. And I think that this wine and those regions really give you that nice balance with just that little hint of spice to it without being too much. And you know, what is interesting about Australian Shiraz, when I've been making Shiraz now 22 years, I've tried these old school French winemaking techniques. I've tried these cutting edge Californian winemaking techniques. And the funny thing about Australian Shiraz is it doesn't want to be fiddled with. So the most easy winemaking that I do is with our Australian Shiraz, and it just works every time. We de-stem it. We ferment it without the stems for about 3 weeks with its skins. We press it off. We put it into oak for 12 months, and then we put it into bottle. So it's really quite easy hands-off winemaking. But for some reason, Australian Shiraz, it just works every time. You always get this beautiful balance, this nice bit of texture. So it's quite interesting how those techniques I've used overseas don't work as well. So you've got to use these different techniques overseas. So it's really interesting how Australian Shiraz just is easy to make. I love how wines that match a country usually match the food. I actually think that one of the best matches with this Shiraz is an Aussie barbecue. You know, the Americans would probably call it a char grill. It's not that really smoky American style. It's like an Australian, you know, gas barbecue type style, like char grill style. I don't think it handles the smoke too smoky in the meat that well, but it's a really great match for that sort of style of food. But cool climate Shiraz, it's exactly what you'd expect to get for a cool climate Shiraz. So we've got a couple more reds. The half of you don't have this. I apologize if you don't have this, because this is actually one of our favorite reds that's coming up next, and that's our Nebbiolo. We ran out with the Nebbiolo in 2015. This is actually a pre-release. I am releasing it now, but I think I would prefer to wait another couple of months. We do a couple of Nebbiolos. We do this one, and we do our Barrel Select Reserve Nebbiolo. The Reserve Nebbiolo is definitely not going to be released yet. Nebbiolo is traditionally from the Barolo region in Italy. Traditionally, they are quite heavy reds. They have like a real like tannin structure to them. The funny thing is with this Nebbiolo, I use a French winemaking technique, which is called post-ferment maceration. I won't talk too much about that now, because when we get onto our Cabernets, I'll talk about that a little bit more. But what it does is it softens those tannins out. So you get this Nebbiolo with these softer tannins. Traditionally, Nebbiolo gives you these beautiful, they describe it as rose and tar. And I love the variety because in Australia, Shiraz, Cabernet, a lot of our red varieties are fruit-driven varieties. What I love about this wine is it's a more floral-driven variety. So you really do get that sort of red, rosy, floral character rather than a fruit character. But then you get this sort of dark, tarry, chocolatey character, and it's that savory floral combination rather than that savory fruit combination that we see in Shiraz and Cabernet. And so I really love this Nebbiolo. It is traditional flavors of a Nebbiolo. Like you really do get that light floral, red floral character. You really do get that sort of tarry. I always and because I use a lot of stems in our ferment, I get that nice licoricey character as well. But normally in Nebbiolo, tannin wise would be big, strong tannins. But what I love about this is using that French technique, and that soften those tannins out. So I'm a huge fan of this Nebbiolo. It is actually one of our most popular reds. And so anyone that does know our wines will be very excited to know that I've finally released it again. And it has been sitting in bottle now for probably about 12 months. It's been sitting in bottle. So I'm a big fan. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the term bottle shock. It does exist. It's something that they still cannot explain in science. I'll taste a wine in a barrel or a tank, and I have all this amazing flavor. We then put it in a bottle, and it just tastes flat. It just loses all that flavor. And I find it takes 12 to 18 months before that flavor comes back again. And so I usually like to wait until that flavor's back before I release it. I'm right on the fence with this Nebbiolo because some days I open it and all that flavors come back. Some days I open it and I think, oh, it needs a little bit more, needs a little bit more time in bottle. If you do get a bottle that you find is a little bit flatter, just give it a decant. And the decanting process the air coming through it will help those flavors come out from the bottle shop. But really nice. I love the Nebbiolo. I don't know what else to say about truffles. If you know what, it is truffle season here in the Highlands. We're about to have a big truffle festival, and truffles is an awesome match with Nebbiolo. I'm trying to think the name of the salami, but it's like a truffle infused style of salami. That and this Nebbiolo, I reckon, is an absolutely stunning match. That truffle goes, anything of those mushroomy truffle flavors go really well with a Nebbiolo. For those of you who don't have the Nebbiolo, you guys have the 2015 Cabernet. The rest of you have a 2017 Cabernet. I think that's right. Have I missed any? No, that's right. So some of you are up to your last wine, which is the 17 Cabernet. Is that right? Is that the last one? Yeah. Oh, that's a shame, isn't it? Last one. So I will talk about the 15 and 17 Cabernets at the same time because they are the same technique. They are slightly different, but very similar. When I was at uni, I was really lucky because there was about Oh yeah, if it doesn't have 17, it's the 15. If it just says Cabernet on it, it's the 15. I was really lucky at uni because I think when I went through uni, there's about 10 of us doing the winemaking degree, and 2 years after me, there was 200. So I got to become a winemaker before it was cool to be a winemaker. But what it meant was I got to try some amazing wines at uni because one of our lecturers, Nick Bulliard, he's a master of wine. He could just grab a bottle from his cellar and bring it in, and the 10 of us could taste it. When there was 200 people, we couldn't just bring a bottle in. And so I got to try some amazing wines. And Nick told this fantastic story one day where he was walking down the street of Adelaide and he happened to look in a skip bin out the front of this pub that was being renovated. And in the bottom of the skip bin was this 375 ml bottle of wine. So Nick, he jumped in, he pulled it out, and he brought it into uni. We all tasted it. Anyway, it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the McGill Vineyard, if you don't know, is the original Penfolds vineyard in Adelaide, and the Burgundy is their original main blend. So this is Penfolds before it was Penfolds, and it was an amazing wine. And aged wines, or aged reds in particular, have these crazy flavors going on. Guava and fish sauce and soy sauce, and you think, you're not really selling these wines to me. You know, the flavors sound crazy. And it reminds me when I was living in Sydney at uni there for a little bit, I had a flatmate who was a chef. And one morning he said to me, "Oh, Jeff, I'm going to cook you French toast." And I thought, cool, sounds good. So, you know, he's got the bread and he's dipped it in the egg and he's fried it up, and then he's put the bacon on top and bananas and maple syrup over the top of it. I'm looking at going, bacon, bananas, maple syrup, and egg. What are you giving me here? This is crazy. And I remember tasting it thinking, this is incredible. The way that the sweet and the fruit and the salty and all those different flavors, the way they combined created this beautiful dish. And to me, this is old wines. Old wines have all these like crazy out there funky flavors like guavas, and you've got these fruit flavors, but then you also have these like funky fish saucy sort of flavors. But the way they all come together is just magical. So ever since trying this wine at uni, I have been obsessed with making a wine that's going to age 50 to 100 years. And when you look around the world at who's famous for making wines, delicate reds that age 50 to 100 years, well, the region that consistently comes up is Bordeaux. And the Bordelais, they created this technique that we call post-ferment maceration. And that's what we use in these wines. And what it is a lot of people don't realize, but if I take a red grape and I squeeze it, the juice and the pulp is actually white. So to create a red wine, I need to extract all that color out of the skins of the red grape. So what I do is I ferment the wine with the skins, and that ferment process takes about 3 or 4 weeks. And that extracts all the color. If I then leave that wine sitting with the skins after the ferment, it's called post-ferment maceration. Now in Australia, we play around with 1-2 months. In Bordeaux, they routinely leave it 12 to 18 months. And the theory behind this is we create a delicate red that's going to age a long time. And when we're aging a red wine, there's 2 problems we have. The first problem is the fruit level. So imagine I have a red wine, the fruit level's here. And as I age that wine, the fruit level's dropping and the savory level's increasing. And when they're about the same, the fruit and the savory, that's the premium drinking is around about there. And that might be 15, 20 years. If I want to age a wine 50 to 100 years, I need to start with a huge amount of stable fruit so that when it balances out with that savory level, it's up here somewhere. So that's the first problem I have when I'm creating a wine that's going to age a long time. The second problem is a structural problem. You know, when you have a really young Cabernet, it kind of has that edgy tannin that sticks to the side of your tongue. It's kind of like chalky, edgy tannin. Those chalky, edgy tannins are short chains. And when I age a bottle of wine, those short chains join together into a long chain, and a long chain is soft and velvety. So that's one of the good things that's happening when we age a bottle of wine. So imagine I have a bottle of wine and I have 100 short tannins in that wine. And as I age that wine in 20 years, those 100 short tannins join to 50 long tannins. And then I age it another 20 years, and those 50 long tannins join into 25 really long tannins. So I've got 25 of these beautiful, sweet, velvety tannins. The problem is 25 is not enough. And so the whole structure of that wine falls apart. And it goes through a process that we call cracking up. And if you've ever tried a really old wine that's cracked up, it is actually the best description for a cracked up wine. It's literally like someone has taken that wine and pulled it apart. So you've got all this flavor on this side and all this flavor on this side, and down the middle is this zigzag of just like water and acid. That's literally what it tastes like. And the process is called cracking up, and that's a structural problem. So when we use this technique, you can imagine I've got a tank of wine and I've got all our skins and seeds and stems in that tank for 18 months. So I have thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around that tank, which forces them together into a long chain tannin. So when I bottle this wine, instead of bottling it with 100 short tannins, I'm bottling it with 100 long stable tannins. And so that's how we get that structural problem. The fruit problem, I have absolutely no idea how the French figured this out. At no stage when you make this wine does it taste fruity. And I remember it would have been probably about 3 months. And I remember coming out to the winery, it's been sitting with the skins for 3 months, and opening a tap, and I took a sample, and I smelt it, and I tasted it, and I thought, oh my God, I have completely ruined this wine. It tastes absolutely disgusting. And I called some winemaking friends. I called all these mentors in the industry going, guys, have you tried this technique? Like, what have I done? And they all said, yeah, Jeff, we tried that technique. It was the same for us. At 3 months, it tasted terrible. So we pressed it off. We put it into oak. But don't worry, Jeff, you'll be able to blend the flavor out. It's fine. So everyone in Australia was telling me to press it off, put it into oak, and blend out the flavor. The guys I talked to in France, they said to me, just leave it. Trust me, just leave it. And so I decided to leave it. Not sure why at the time, but I did. I guess because at the time, Tractorless Vineyard, when I started the label, this was a side project. I was doing a lot of consulting. I was doing a lot of contract winemaking, and Tractorless was a label I produced to make wines the way I want to do them, purely to keep me passionate and interested about winemaking. Different techniques, old techniques, new techniques. It was, I guess, my fun play around label. And so that's why I decided to leave it with the skins. And I remember I got to 18 months and tasted it. Oh, no, 12 months and tasted it. And I thought, yeah, it's not really that much better. And I waited 18 months, and I remember tasting it, and I could taste that those tannins had softened out and polymerized. And so we put it into oak, and it was 18 months in oak. And I remember bottling this wine, and I remember thinking, am I doing the right thing here? Because I cannot taste any fruit in this. I can taste skins and seeds and stems, but no fruit. Am I about to end up with pallets of wine that I can't sell? I thought, well, I've already started bottling. I've already got the bottles. I may as well do it. So I bottled it. And then about 12 months later, out of nowhere, was this absolute explosion of fruit. These really intense capsicum, cassis sort of tomato leaf characters in the wine. And I am now really excited about this. So 2015, the guys of you who've got our 2015 Cabernet, this is a 6-year-old Cabernet. When you smell it, it's got real intense fruit. You taste it, it's got those nice, soft, delicate, velvety tannins. So I'm super excited about the way this wine is progressing. I would never have believed that these techniques would give you such intense fruit characters. In 50 years' time, we can get back on Zoom and I will tell you whether this experiment worked or not. I say that because I do not know anyone in Australia to date that has actually done this technique. So Wine Australia did a huge project on post-ferment maceration, and that project went to 6 months. And that's because they got to that 3-month stage where it tasted terrible. They tasted it, analyzed it. They took it 4 months, tasted, analyzed it, no change. 5 months, tasted, analyzed it, no change. 6 months, tasted, analyzed it, no change. And so they stopped the project. And I can tell you now, between 3 months and 12 months, nothing happens in these wines. Between 12 and 18, everything happens. And so I don't know what's going on in that later stage. There's something happening, but I'm really excited about them. The 2015 for me had a little bit too much capsicum, and I wanted to get a little bit more of that cassis flavor. And so in 2016, I let the grapes ripen 4 more weeks. They got too ripe. So 2016, we haven't even released. The tannins got too ripe. Something happened when they polymerized out, and it's a kind of a nothing wish-washy wine. And so we haven't released that. 2017, I let it ripen about 1 or 2 weeks more than the 15, but 1 or 2 weeks less than the 16, and I reckon we've nailed it for this one. So the 17, again, this is a pre-release. I personally believe it probably needs another 6 months in bottle for those fruit flavors to come back, but it does have this beautiful dusty sort of mint sort of Cabernet character, a little bit riper than the 15. So I think in our parallel museum tasting packs, we're going to have to do the 15 and the 17. I switched over to the 17 because I'm down to my last pallet of the 15 and I didn't want to use it all. And so that's why I've switched over. But they're both in the same style. They're both a style that's meant to age and age and age. I'm really excited the way they are aging so far. And you'd probably agree, you know, for even in the 17, which is, I guess, considered a younger Cabernet, and the 15, those fruit levels, when I smell it, I would expect them to be a lot more hard on the palate, but they're quite soft tannins. And so I'm quite excited about those two wines. For those of you who that was your last wine and the 17, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you hang around for just a little bit for me to do the last one for everyone else, because those of you who do have our original packs will have what we call 8,000 vintages. And think of it, it's a bit of a mixed blessing. So if you missed out on some of the wines, this 8,000 vintage again is one of our most popular ones, but the problem is you can't buy it. So those of you who do have it will get to taste it, but you won't be able to ever buy it, well, not until next year. So it's like whetting your appetite. The oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe, and it's dated 6,000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. So they've got some serious wine history going on there. If you're into history, there's a great book called Ancient Wine, and it talks about how they proved the ancient, how they proved where the ancient wine was. I was lucky enough to spend 7 years consulting in Georgia. The Georgians do a really famous red wine style that they call Kinsmarauli, and I'm going to type that in the notes because it's hard to spell. Kinsmarauli. That's the name of the style. Super famous in Russia and Georgia. This is my Australian version of Kinsmarauli. So we call it 8,000 vintages. It kind of tastes like a light port. It's got the depth and complexity and Christmas cake character like a tawny port, but it has those fresh red fruit characters like a ruby port or a nice fermented red, but it's not fortified at all. So 8,000 vintages is a beautiful match with that American style, smoky style. I used to love ending on it because it is quite a different style. I'm sorry for you guys that don't have it. For those of you that do have it, I'm sorry that you can't buy it. Our next one is coming out in 2022. So definitely stay tuned for that. So guys, that's all the wines I've got for you today. I hope that you guys all enjoyed it. I do sometimes get a little bit sidetracked and excited about stories. Last Friday, I think I went for hours. I'm getting, the more I do, the better I get at making my stories shorter. I will hang up. I'm going to hang on here for a little bit longer. So if you have any questions, please definitely ask them. When I go, I will keep this live. So you're more than welcome to hang out with your friends and stay a bit longer. I did see some questions back here further. Which uni? I was in Wagga, not Adelaide. Yes, I spent 1 year in Wagga, just opposite on Edward Street, opposite McDonald's. There, I wasn't really there that often, but yeah. So I did spend a bit of time in Wagga. Can I taste an event in? Yes. So yes, we will definitely be releasing more and more events where we can like pair them off and look at parallels and we sort of did loads of virtual tastings last year, and then they petered off and we were just ticking over a bit, and they just went bananas again. Well, you can imagine with the lockdowns now, and so my poor brother-in-law, whenever they shut everything down, unfortunately, he's in an industry where he loses his job, but he spent all of 2020 and now pretty much since lockdown pouring big bottles into little bottles. So I think he's already done a couple of thousand since the lockdown already. So, but he's becoming an expert of pouring the little bottles, yeah, and putting in those little containers. Now, those little bottles, they can be recycled. So please do take them to down to your recycling. We would love to use them again, but we're not allowed to. So because of all the health restrictions in Australia, we're not allowed to reuse them. So, but please do recycle them. Well, guys, thanks for joining me today. Oh, what else? I know I do have to sell you wine. I always forget that bit. If you do want to buy some wine, please don't get confused. We make good wine. We have a terrible website. You will end up at a website called Vincentia Cellars. They manage all our online orders for us. So when you end up on that site, don't get confused. That is where you're meant to end up. We will get given that order and ship it out. Please don't jump straight on, because the Nebbiolo and the 17 Cabernet haven't entered in the system yet. I'm doing that when I hang up from you. So give me just a little bit of time. But guys, thanks very much. I will stay here a bit. Please tell your friends. I hope you enjoyed it. What I might do is I'm going to cross off my what's this called, video. But I will stay on the chat for a bit and chat and answer any questions you want. My phone numbers. I know. Is that someone's saying my phone number's not connected? The one on the website does something really weird. The one on the website is meant to divert to our actual phone line, and our phone line is working, but it's something going on with our website. I'm going to put it up 48781588. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to get my phone and double check I'm giving you the right number. But it does work. But yes, I'm told constantly the one on the website doesn't work. Give me 1 second. So 48. Oh, that's why. 48581788. Yeah, that's the right one. Maybe I've put it wrong on our website. You think after a year of doing virtual tastings, we would have sorted out our website. Well, guys, thanks very much. Have a lovely Saturday evening. We do have pre-recorded sessions, and we do these. I do a Friday and then a Saturday and a Friday and Saturday. So if you ever want to join again, or you've forgotten about something, or you have one glass that you want to know about, you're more than welcome to join in on any of our sessions. And they all are very different, because depending on what I'm doing on that day, I talk about different things a bit. So you do learn different things at different times. Thanks very much, guys. Enjoy your evening. I am going to mute out, but I will be watching the chat. So if you do have a question, you're more than welcome to ask on the chat. See you guys later. And you're allowed to unmute and talk to each other now if you want.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it. Hello.
No.
Who has got their microphone on?
No.
Both got your microphones on, but one of you
Oh,
That's good. That's your
are we going to sing him happy birthday?
Oh, yeah.
Where's Chris?
Birthday to you.
Happy
birthday to you. Happy birthday.
Yes, Sabrina.
Happy
Happy birthday.